Good morning to everyone. I'm Latoya Pouncey, master teacher. Just got word that I'll be at Booker T. Washington next year. Um, Welcome to the Caddo Middle School Math Summer Training for the sixth grade math course deep dive. Um, I will be your host today. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, Lindsay and Amanda, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Hey, I'm Lindsay Hassey, and I teach 6th, 7th, and Algebra 1 at Erie Drive.
I'm Amanda Waddell. I teach 6th grade Gateway at Caddo Middle Magnet.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, so today in this lesson, we're going to look at 4 kind of main topics. We're going to really explore Unit 1 and become more familiar with the standards that are associated with that and just the overall point of Unit 1 and where it's trying to get our students to be. We're going to look at the instructional resources that we have available to us to use with Unit 1, and then look at how we can really apply those to high quality lesson plans. And we're going to definitely look at the potential unfinished learning gaps that we have talked so much about due to those 2020 spring closures, and hopefully get you a little bit better of an idea or a plan or somewhere to start to address those. And then we're going to take all of that and consider the best practices for using our given curriculum in the context of classroom and obviously virtual learning if we end up going back to that situation. So in general, Unit 1, they're going to use what they've learned about area, and they're really going to start to include shapes that are not composed simply of rectangles. And what that means specifically is they're going to start seeing shapes that are composed of rectangles and triangles is going to be that really key new shape that they start to deal with. And that's going to really rely on them to access and engage with that skill of composing and decomposing shapes. And then to identify rectangles and squares as being composed of triangles. And they'll learn to talk and they'll start developing skills to have those mathematical discussions and release their ideas on that. So that's kind of the key. The big thing that we need to keep in mind that I think it's easy to overlook with Unit 1 is we are going to start using that algebraic expression and equation language. And so up until this point, many of them have really seen that X as that multiplication symbol, and we're going to want to start to move them away from that X because of X as a variable. And so we're going to want to move them to the dot notation. That is what illustrative math uses. I know a lot of us know the parentheses also can mean to multiply. I typically do both interchangeably, but the dot notation is what they will see in the illustrative math text. So that's something to keep in mind just as you proceed through Unit 1. But when you look at the next slide, we're going to go into a little bit more specific overview of Unit 1, because Unit 1 is a big unit, and it can be broken down into 2 very specific sections. In fact, there is a diagnostic to Unit 1, which Ms. Pouncey will talk about, and then there's also a mid-unit assessment and then an end-of-unit assessment. And so it does a really nice job of splitting Unit 1 into 2 parts. So that first part, they're going to be able to, or they should be able to build their abilities about the rectangles and finding area of them through decomposition and rearranging and some other strategies you'll run into, enclose and subtract. And they're going to do that with rectangles and triangles and shapes, irregular shapes. And then that kind of goes into the second one, strategies for finding parallelograms and triangles and repeating those to develop formulas for areas. So if you were in the 6th grade advanced, I know one of the algebra teachers mentioned that they don't know where those formulas come from. This is where those students are going to start to develop those skills of learning, okay, well, if the area for finding a triangle is half base times height, where does that come from? It comes from the fact that base times height is the area for a rectangle, and then if you cut it in half of a rectangle is a triangle, that's where you get that half from. So that's going to start to develop that. And then they're going to understand that polygons can be decomposed into triangles to solve it. So funky shapes that they might not immediately know how to find the area of, they're going to be able to start to break them down and find that area. And that's really the first half of the unit. The second half goes into surface area, which is a big thing in 7th grade. So students are going to start to find surface area, and they focus on rectangular prisms and cubes, and they do a little with triangular surfaces, but not many. I think there's like 1 or 2 shapes. And then they study nets, and those do have triangles. And then they use the nets to determine surface area and whatnot. And they also look at volume in this section as well. So that's kind of a more specific overview of Unit 1 and kind of what you're looking at doing. So with all of that being said, one thing for me that's helped me over the years is really understanding what standards we're looking at Unit 1. And so there's actually 2 sets of standards. You have geometry standards that are being taught, and then you also, we'll get to those in just a minute, but you have equation and expression standards that are being taught. So if you notice, it's 6G1 or 6GA, 6G1, 6G2, and then 6G4. So we actually don't cover 6G3, which has to do with coordinate planes. We'll get to that in a later unit, but these are the ones that we cover. So obviously area, surface area, volume. It says, you know, 1 is area of right triangles, special quadrilaterals, decomposing, rearranging, and real world problems. So you see that, that's really area. 2 is going to deal with volume of rectangular prisms with fractional edges. And if you look down the unit cubes, it says packing it by unit cubes. This is something that I learned the hard way. This skill of packing unit cubes is a little in depth, but it circles back around in Unit 4. So don't freak out if your students aren't getting it immediately, because they will come back to that skill in the fraction unit. And then 4 goes into nets and surface area and those 3-dimensional figures. So that's really what we're looking at as far as standards for geometry. And then if you want to go to the next slide, we'll see the standards for equations and expressions. And again, this has more so to do with numerical expressions than algebraic, but they do involve a little bit of algebraic expressions in this unit. So obviously read, write, numerical, evaluate, numerical. You see evaluate expressions where letters stand for numbers. And you'll see this a lot when you decompose and rearrange, because they're gonna have to shift and say, okay, if there's a missing side here, and then take information from that shape over and apply to figure out the missing sides. And I use variables to fill those unknown numbers in. That kind of goes into 2 and 2A. And then 2C, evaluate expressions at specific variables. So you'll see that more towards the end of the unit when you get into the surface area and the volume and really formulas. That's where that comes in, that being able to interact and solve those formulas. So that's where we see expressions and equations really come out in Unit 1. And those are the 6th grade standards that we cover in this unit. Let's talk about the 5th grade stuff. So our incoming students most likely missed these 6 standards. 6 doesn't sound like a lot, but if you've been in some of these, you are probably starting to realize these 6 are really big standards. And like, I know, you know, MDC has 4 substandards under it. And so these 6 are important for our kids, but there is good news. So Ms. Pouncey, if you want to click one of these that are in red are actually linked to the companion document for 5th grade. So if you don't particularly know what that standard, I mean, if you can't get a good visual of what that standard looks like just from reading it, because sometimes these standards are really wordy, then there is the companion document attached to that. It'll give you the standard, it'll give you an example, it'll show you what that standard looks like in a functional context. So I know that this standard, what they probably missed was the fact that they might not understand or translate finding the area with whole numbers to finding the area of a shape with fractional lengths. So that is how this is helpful to you. And it's there. You don't have to go search for it. You don't have to see, search through all of the 5th grade stuff, because that can be daunting. So that's all linked there for you. You want to go back. And the good news, at least when we start back in August, if you look at the next slide. So this is what it essentially looks like. These are the 6 standards that we missed, and the arrows point to the impacted standards that you'll run into in 6th grade. So there's truly only 3 standards that we're going to encounter in the first unit that are impacted by those missed standards from 5th grade. And then if you look, interestingly enough, the 2 direct geometry standards that students will have missed don't impact Unit 1 at all, because those standards have to deal with coordinate planes. And we encounter those in not a geometry unit, but in the integer unit, I want to say, is when the coordinate plane comes out. But again, these red standards, if you want to click one of those, Ms. Pouncey, those are linked to the mapped standard on the coherence map. So again, you've probably heard coherence map be thrown around if you've been to any of these, but the coherence map is a really good key, because what it does is it maps the standard for you, and it shows you where they're coming from. So prior grade level standards that might just continue to contribute to gaps, but also where those standards are proceeding for 6, 7, so on. And if you scroll down on the coherence map, you get more information about it. So you get examples, and you also get tasks that they can work if you want to just practice that standard. And that might be something that you can use as a diagnostic to see if they really understand that standard, to see where they are. So the coherence map is a great tool for you to use. And again, those 5th grade standards are linked to their particular mapped standards on the coherence map for you. And then these are the specific lessons that you will encounter in Unit 1 that have been identified as potentially being impacted from those missed 6th grade standards. So if you look, there's 8 lessons there. And the way that I see this is, I'm going to start these lessons and I'm going to think, okay, this is where I need to put, plan to do a mini lesson, or plan to remediate before, or plan to be prepared for my students to struggle a little bit with this. So this is a really good tool just to give you a heads up while you're planning and before you get into a classroom and realize, oh, this is why they're struggling with this. They're already kind of laid out for you. So that is kind of the intro into Unit 1 and the standards overview, and really how the spring closures are going to directly affect our first unit. Now, I know you've seen larger versions of this document floating around. There are obviously more units throughout the entire year that will be impacted from these missed standards, but this is just specifically for Unit 1.
Amanda, there's a question in the chat that
Oh,
says,
yes.
so we can expect students to understand rectangular area, but perhaps not with fractions involved.
According to the information that we've received and how the standards are written, I would assume that students know how to find area, but they might have trouble translating that into a fractional context. But specifically the area of a rectangle or a square, no other shapes.
I muted myself. Okay. You've seen me walk through this before in the strategies to address unfinished learning webisode PD on yesterday. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time walking through this. I am going to from here kind of link it to some other things that you now have information about, such as Khan Academy and things of that nature, and just show you how those things can link to remediation. So I previously discussed, as far as remediation of what do we use for it, and I discussed with you all that it is embedded. We have unit diagnostic, which is something we can use. And as Amanda just previously spoke, about how if you want to know if the students understand, maybe go pull the previous year, the 5th grade task for the coherence standard for 6GA1, and you can possibly use it to see if they understand it. Or we can use the unit diagnostic. We can also use the, as we go through and we assess them and we understand if they're proficient. And we determine how we want to remediate. What is it going to look like in our classroom? And then we remediate that skill. A couple options that were previously discussed was that the instructional lesson has embedded remediation opportunities for that particular lesson. So sometimes you don't have to be as intentional as going back and grabbing that task, as Amanda before mentioned, to diagnose whether or not they understand the standard or not, or even a task to understand whether or not they are they understood what you taught that day. In the instruction, of course, if we go to the scope and sequence, it gives us our unit, the lesson that we're going to do, and the standard, the on-grade level standard. It also gives us a lot of good information about where we can go get other instructional resources and what we can use for unfinished learning or remediation. If you notice that, of course, some of the standards from 5th grade are here that are unfinished learning for lesson 1 and 2 of unit 1. And of course, then our curriculum is also going to tell us what this particular lesson is building upon. And we're addressing 6GA, but we're building upon 3MDC, 7D, which takes us a little further back than the 5th grade lesson. So if I go back to the coherence map, I can always go in and find the 6th grade standard, the geometry standard, and I can go into and look at the coherence map for that. And as I go through, you'll find that, yes, 6GA here is in the middle. We'll find that 5NFB B4 is listed as a standard we should learn. And then we find that 3MDC ties right into that 5th grade standard. So the coherence map can help us understand exactly what I need to do. And so if I click on this 3rd grade, which is my curriculum is telling me it's focusing here, and I find that standard, I have progressions that I can look at to help me to understand how can I embed this remediation. There's an assessment item here that I can probably reach back and grab, as Amanda stated, as possibly a diagnostic item, or just an item to help remediate with before the students go into the new learning. As they go into the new learning, we can also consider what's already in the curriculum, which is the activity narrative, which again points out that in this particular lesson, we'll go by counting squares. If we look at that coherence map, that activity was finding area, counting squares, and it leads to answer that question that Marty had just a moment ago, that they can kind of understand how to find area by counting squares and knowing area of rectangular and square polygons. Of course, there's in the activity launch, it gives us some ideas of how we can go ahead and remediate that skill and make sure that they have an understanding of the foundation of that 3rd grade standard going into the 6th grade standard. The misconceptions help us speak to how we can walk around and as they're working, how we can support them, as far as discussing that they may count some of the partial portions of of a square as a full square. And that's where we're getting into that 5th grade standard of making sure that they understand fractions in context of finding area and multiplying fractions. And then in the activity synthesis, it wants you to sit around and have a really deep discussion and use some of that vocabulary, such as decomposing and arranging, subtracting and enclosing, to help them further bring all of that knowledge together. So our curriculum has a lot of embedded remediation that we can use to help our students get to the cool down, which is our exit ticket, which is here. They're not necessarily looking to see whether or not they know that it's going to, that the appropriate units is inches. It's more of, can they decompose, rearrange, and find the area of this shaded portion and do the multiplication that's involved in finding the shaded portion, which is that 5th grade standard. And then I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Okay, so during the quarantine, I learned several resources that can be really helpful if all of a sudden we're having to go to distant learning again. And also, I always had parents asking for additional help and additional resources last year, and I really didn't know where to look because illustrative is just so different than other past curriculums. And so I came, across these 2 resources, Khan Academy. If you just type in Khan Academy 6th grade illustrative math, the whole Khan Academy has a whole curriculum that is aligned with illustrative math. So Latoya, if you'll click on that, I'll kind of show them what it looks like. All right, so this is Unit 1. And you can click on the lessons. If you notice, they don't have anything for lesson 1 and 2. A lot of the lessons that are missing on the Khan Academy illustrative math are the same lessons that we skip on our scope and sequence. So if you'll click on lesson 3, you can kind of see how it's laid out. So for lesson 3, they just have an actual video where you can watch. Scroll down.
Hey, Lindsay, let me say right here that if anybody's new and doesn't know how to get to this particular page where you are, at the beginning of each unit in the scope and sequence, you'll see a Khan Academy link, and it'll take you here.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so here, if you look at lesson 6, you can see on the left-hand side, they have like where it says learn, and they have like a little play button. So these are videos. And then if you look on the right-hand side, they have practice, and it's just a few questions to go over what they just watched in the video. So I really plan on using this in my classroom this year just for that extra practice. You can create an account like as a teacher, and you can sign your kids up. I didn't do that last year because I just started using this during the quarantine. But next year, I'm going to have an account for each of my kids, and this is going to be part of like their homework or classwork for early finishers, just to make sure they're really understanding the material. And it'll help the parents too, I think.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you one more time. I just want to throw out there for those who were not able to be a part of the digital resources session yesterday, we will probably set up a recorded version of some Khan Academy training, just very basic on how to set up students that Lindsay's talking about, and just do some of the other basic features, because there are some shortcuts and ways to do that without too much work. And we want to make sure everybody has access to that information and if you want it.
All right, so the second resource that I used during the quarantine that I had heard my kids talk about Mr. Morgan, so they found him way before I did. But if you go to YouTube, there's this teacher named Mr. Morgan who has already, he's recorded himself teaching the lessons. And so when you go to YouTube, you enter like for 6th grade lesson, Unit 1, Lesson 1, you would enter 611. So you do the grade, the unit, and then the lesson you want, and then just type in Mr. Morgan and it comes up. And there's multiple, so he has like the whole unit, the whole lesson recorded. And then there's also one where it's just the practice problems recorded. So this one that I linked on the PowerPoint is the whole lesson. So it's Unit 1, Lesson 1, and he covers the entire lesson. So I'm going to post these on Google Classroom this year so the kids just to give the parents more guidance, because I had a lot of parents last year just saying, I don't know how to help my kids with this work or help them with their homework. I know they may copy the homework and not actually do it, but at least they're watching the videos and hopefully, learning something. I think they're going home and probably doing it anyway, some of them. So I plan on posting these to my Google Classroom each day to just kind of help parents and help the kids at home with some of the problems. And also, like, if you have students that are absent, you can assign this where they can work through the lessons with Mr. Morgan at home on days that they're not at school. So maybe it'll help with some of that with kids that miss a lot of school. Okay, so for the assessments, and they were talking about this earlier, the curriculum already has a pre-assessment for each lesson. I know at Uri Drive, we only have 50-minute classes, so we're already having a hard time getting through the curriculum. So we don't always use the pre-assessments, but I know that a lot of schools do. Then they have a mid-unit assessment and an end-of-unit assessment, and then the cool downs. So what I typically do is I have a classroom set of Chromebooks, and so I do all of my assessments using Google Forms. And I've created a lot of different exit tickets using the cool downs, and I've created all of my tests on Google Forms this past year. And so if you'll click on the exit ticket, you can kind of see what it looks like. So this was my exit ticket for Unit 1, Lesson 2 and 3. And I typically do multiple choice and fill in the blank just because the computer grades it. And sometimes it's just a couple questions, and it just helps me to quickly assess, what the students know and what they don't know. I think it's important for us to test the kids on the computer as much as possible, because that's what how they have to test at the end of the year. If you don't have a classroom set of Chromebooks, you can actually print these out. And so I've done that before too. Like if I'm having a sub and I don't necessarily want them on the Chromebooks while I'm not there, I'll print them out. Oh, another thing too, and Amanda can tell you more about this. I really haven't looked into it yet, but EdgeElastic is another source that you can build test and exit tickets, and it has a lot of illustrative questions already built into it. I'm supposed to get with her and learn more about it, but that's something else, another resource that you can use to test them digitally.
Just one thing about EdgeElastic. So before we move on, EdgeElastic does link to your Google Classroom, so it's really easy to import students. So that's a good tool to look into.
So the next slide is the Unit 1 LEAP practice questions. These are also on the scope and sequence. So these are practice questions that what they're going to see. These are release test items. So I definitely recommend using these as a bell ringer or just a quick, these problems tend to be a little bit more difficult than what they see in class maybe. So these are great to use as a bell ringer or exit ticket. And like I said, they're on the scope and sequence. And this is just revisiting the objectives kind of that we went over today. We explored and talked about the standard pacing for 6th grade. Unit 1, it's area and surface area. We examined the available instructional resources for use with Unit 1 and apply those to develop high quality lesson plans. We identified potential unfinished learning gaps due to the spring 2020 closures and developed plans to address the challenge. And we consider best practices for using the illustrative math curriculum in context of virtual learning environments. Jennifer is saying in the chat room that she has all the EdgeElastic illustrative math units she can send, which is awesome, because at the end of this, I've created a Google Classroom for 6th grade math, so we can all kind of share resources that we've already have and created. All right, so the next step, we're going to use the 2020-2021 scope and sequence document for middle school math course to teach and identify the first lesson with potential unfinished learning. We're going to study the prior grade standards and other related materials, and there's a link to get started on that. If you're new to teaching this course and or curriculum, you write lesson plans for the identified lesson with specific strategies for addressing the unfinished learning. And if you taught this course in Caddo last year, consider how you might need to modify your existing lesson plan to address the challenge. Okay, here's all three of our contact information. We all want to be there for anyone who needs help, especially new teachers. I know when we first started, we were pretty lost. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to email us anytime. Here's a Google Classroom that I created. So this is the class code if everybody wants to take a minute and log into Google and join. I've already created, me and the other 6th grade math teachers at Uri, we have put together exit tickets, practice, unit tests, and I'll upload anything that I've already created that I can share with you to help. Amanda is going to help with the EdgeElastic. I think she's already got a lot of resources. Another teacher that says she has a lot of EdgeElastic resources too. So this is just a place that we can upload our assessments and things that we've created and communicate and hopefully, help each other out so we're not recreating the wheel.
Hey, Lindsay, and Jennifer may want to join in on this too since she added something about it, but can you give a little more detail on how the EdgeElastic materials are shared, the items there?
Amanda could probably tell you more about that because she's used it a lot more.
EdgeElastic, there's different settings that you can set tests to. So like public, private, school library to see who's accessible. I always make mine public and then it'll give you a link. And as long as you have that link, it'll take you to the test. So you could upload that link into Google, into the classroom. And then from there, you could either use that test or you could copy that test and then modify it if you needed to add more or take away, just depending on where you were, where your students were. And so it's a link share would be the best way to do it.
Sounds great, thanks. And anything that's added there, if you guys will make sure you label those files clearly, whether it's a link or whether it's a document, just make sure you're clear on your labels so that when the teacher goes there and they see that, then they'll know what it is. And we'll probably, Lindsay, we'll need to dig in and try to make sure you're probably already doing this, but trying to make sure that information is easily found, like as we start getting more and more in there, so that if a teacher's searching for something, they won't have too much trouble finding what they're looking for.
Yeah, I was thinking we need to create folders and break it down by unit for sure, maybe even unit and lesson.
I may have an option. I have a spreadsheet that has it done by unit and lesson, and each column, like I have the Mr. Morgan videos in one column, and I have the IM videos from YouTube in another column. Then I have EdgeElastic as a column, and everything, like so my assessments, my practice forms, it's all on one single spreadsheet by unit and by lesson.
Oh, that's great. That would be
that was posed about, I know this is unit 1, but I'm guessing we will need to cover a lot on first quadrant coordinate graphing. Is that right? In this particular unit 1, they won't need to cover, you won't need to cover anything about the coordinate plane. I want to say that's 6.
That's at the very end.
7.
I think that's 7. That's unit 7. We get into when the students will get into the coordinate plane. So for right now, for unit 1 is just strictly finding the area, building on that 5th grade standard of finding the area of rectangular figures, of parallelograms, and building it into irregular shapes and building it into polyhedras. So it's going to take it to where they need to decompose or rearrange irregular figures, and then it'll build into where they would have to use the net of polyhedras to find the surface area and volume.
Yeah, I knew all, yeah, I understood that. I'm just concerned about what we have to do. And I know this isn't necessarily what we're talking about in terms of building in a lot of time to do first quadrant stuff.
Right. I think
with the
Mark, I
relationship
get what you're
between
saying.
variables and things.
I normally really count on my students understanding how to graph in that first quadrant before we add in, negatives and things like that. I would plan to go ahead and just maybe build it in through bell ringers before we even get to Unit 7. So that they have that preloaded knowledge before you start adding in different, because I know there's a good chunk of Unit 7 spent on the coordinate plane, but there's not a lot spent just specifically on that first quadrant, positive on positive.
And it's actually going to have to be in Unit 6.
Right.
Because we end Unit 6 talking about two related quantities and doing that table representation and graph representation. Okay.
That's what I was going to say, Mark. I was going to build back to Unit 6 if you want to specifically get that first quadrant. Go back and start building it in there when we're comparing two quantities.
The biggest thing is Roger doesn't want us spending days teaching 5th grade material. They're wanting us to kind of build as we go.
So once you get to it, you may want to go back and reach back to those standards, previous standards that deal with that, or put it into some type of remediation, foundational skill building thing, with them. Once you get to that unit, you don't need to worry about it in Unit 1 because you'll have plenty of opportunities for them in the coming units.
Yeah, I think in yesterday's 10 a.m. session, if you were there, we just mapped out a very sketchy plan to, and the first step in that plan, I think, was to always be looking ahead, particularly when you see the UL lessons marked, and just try to get your mind wrapped around, what they might have missed in the prior grade and what would be the most efficient way to address that, before I start teaching that on grade level topic. And that's where it's going to be probably impossible for us as a district to put out guidance for each of those situations. So, you're going to have to do some planning. Of course, I'm happy to come in and get involved anytime you want me to with that. If we need to set up more Zoom meetings along the way, that's fine. We're actually trying to work out some plans to do some unit by unit sessions throughout the school year, where we do the same kind of deal for Unit 2 and the same kind of deal for Unit 3 and so forth. But the first step in that plan is just kind of looking ahead and being aware of what's coming and then trying to find the most efficient way to tackle the problem.
Another thing I was going to say, another resource too that may be helpful doing some of the looking back into 5th grade math would just be like using some of the ed puzzles. I don't know if y'all have used those before, but they're great, like little kind of quick mini lessons. And I've used those to kind of as homework to cover things that they should have known in previous grades that maybe they forgot. You can make your own, but there's thousands of them already created. So you can probably already find one that covers the material you need to cover.
Hey, I'm going to say my last piece unless somebody has a question specifically for me, but let me say thank you to everybody who participated today. It really means a lot to see you guys showing up. And then most of all, thank you to our 3 presenters, to Lindsay and Amanda and Latoya, for putting the hours into this that they did. I know they went above and beyond and worked more than I asked them to work on this. So they deserve a lot of praise and a lot of thanks for putting this together. So thank y'all so much. And if I don't happen to see any of you guys again on a computer screen between now and the school year, I hope you have a wonderful summer. Take time for yourself and your family so that you can come back refreshed to whatever we face in August.
Phyllis asked about a specific lesson plan. I think lesson plans are going to really be depending on your administration. I think every school kind of uses something different. I'm not sure about, like Latoya could tell you more about the TAP schools if they have a certain lesson plan to use. I know at URI we have kind of our own lesson plan. So I'd be willing to share mine, but I don't know that your principal would allow you to use mine per se.
You answered it, Lindsay. TAP schools, zone schools do have a specific lesson plan template that will be given to you by your administration. And other schools is the same as just what Lindsay said. The administration will let you know what your lesson plan template is.
And I'm more than happy to share mine. I have them for 6th, 7th, and Algebra 1. I just, like I said, I don't know. Mine are pretty basic, so.
These are, again, our email addresses. If you want to jot them down, they're all caddoschools.org. So if you want to jot them down, feel free to email any of us if there's any resources you need. Of course, you can also reach out to us in the Google Classroom by sending us a message or posting something in the Google Classroom that you may feel is more to the crowd versus to just direct to this crowd versus directed to one person.